Thank you for joining us on today's segment of Neonatology Today Media. I'm your host, Kimberly Hillyer, and today we have with us Erica Komisar. She is a clinical social worker, psychoanalysis, and parent guidance expert who has been in private practice in New York City for over 30 years. Her new book, Chicken Little, The Sky Isn't Falling, Raising Resilient Adolescents in the New Age of Anxiety, has come out. Your book is entitled Chicken Little, The Sky Isn't Falling, Raising Resilient Adolescents in a New Age of Anxiety. What was your inspiration?
So the title was based on that childhood book, Chicken Little, The Sky is Falling. And you know, that cute little chicken that's running around saying, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. And it was a book to say, actually, the sky isn't falling. It feels like it's falling when your children are not doing well. We say we're only as happy as our least happy child. So it certainly feels like the sky is falling. But again, it was meant to be a somewhat hopeful title. And I wrote this book because I was really, responding to this mental health crisis and this epidemic of mental illness in children and adolescents. And it really was my way of writing a book that kind of cut through a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about raising adolescents, and educated parents about things like the brain science, meaning understanding what's actually going on in terms of your child's neurological development that helps you to understand their behavior and also helps you to be more empathic. But I think one big reason I wrote this book is I had a very hard adolescence. I was bullied and teased. My parents loved me a lot, but did not know how to help me with that situation at school. And so it's very personal for me. It's probably one of the reasons I did become a therapist, because I did have some adversity in childhood that I had to overcome. But I wanted to give parents the tools that I wish my parents had had.
So, your first book, Being There, Why Prioritizing Motherhood in the First 3 Years Matters. Is there a connection between the two books?
Absolutely. So the first book was about the first 3 years of a child's life, and really the brain development, the neurological development that is connected to secure attachment, meaning mothers or primary attachment figures, sometimes today their fathers, are critical for the healthy emotional development of children in the first 3 years. By 1,000 days or 3 years, 85% of a child's right brain or social emotional brain is developed. We call it a critical window because it's a child is incredibly sensitive in that critical window to the environment and to stress in the environment. And the second critical window, where parents, being part of the environment, a big part of the environment, have a great impact on children's brain development and emotional development, is the second critical window, which is adolescence, 9 to 25, which we know now that adolescence starts earlier, as early as 9, and ends later than we understood many generations ago. It ends at 25. And we know that because we have the technology to know that.
So, in your first book, you described how parental attachment creates resiliency later on in life. How does this book address that issue?
So, I mean, you could think of the first critical window as laying down the foundation of emotional security that helps that child through life, but certainly carries them into adolescence. So they have the foundation of that security to cope with adversity in the future. So children aren't born resilient. So that is a misunderstanding. And I think it's a misunderstanding. Again, we project onto very young children adult-like characteristics because we don't want to see them as vulnerable, because if they're as vulnerable as they actually are, then it means that we have to give up more. And I think that we project onto them that they're not vulnerable, that they are strong and resilient. And you'll often hear parents say, oh, you know, my child can take it, and children are, you know, they bounce back and they'll be fine. And actually children are not fine, and that's what we're finding. But But basically, the first critical window of that emotional security gives that child who heads into adolescence an advantage, which is they are ready to deal more with the storms of adolescence when they come. And what we're finding today is more children are heading into adolescence more fragile. Many of them with attachment disorders, many of them with untreated depression and anxiety. And so when you head into adolescence, which is itself a trauma and a storm, you're more likely, you're more susceptible to breakdown.
Wow. Yeah, you know, as I think about myself growing up, I remember being taught, especially as a Black woman, that you need to be independent. You really need to be self sufficient. So, with all these cultural concepts and factors, societal factors, how does your book address this?
I want to pick up on the word strong, because I think there's a lot of emphasis in our society, and maybe in particular in the Black community, on creating, and I understand some of the history behind it, but creating strength with self-sufficiency. And I think it exists everywhere, in America in particular, that we're a very self-sufficiency, independence, self-determination driven culture. And I think what it's doing is it's creating very rigid, fragile, defensively independent young people. You know, I think of interdependence as a way forward, which is that strength comes from the ability, well, we say in my field, in psychoanalysis, we say a strong ego, the strongest ego is an ego where when someone that you love or cares for you is around, that you can lean on them when you are in distress. So in other words, giving our children strength means to make it possible for them to lean on us and be dependent on us when they can, and then to be flexible enough to switch tacks when no one's around, to be able to lean on themselves. But when someone's around, to create strength in relationships. And so it's more like flexibility. I think of I guess the metaphor would be an oak tree is probably more likely to lose its branches in a hurricane because it's a hard wood and a rigid wood. And stands alone, whereas maybe a group of willows or softwood trees that bend in the wind don't lose their branches and stand together. And so I think of human beings like that in a way, this kind of hyper focus on self-sufficiency and independence and as a sign of strength is actually weakening our children. There's a wonderful article that was written in the Philadelphia Inquirer by a psychoanalyst, a colleague, the other day, about how dependency and neediness, and I write about this all the time too, but how dependency and neediness is seen as a curse word in our culture, is seen as a bad thing. It's stigmatized, as opposed to saying, right, if we don't need each other, where does our strength come from, right? And I think it's also the devaluing of nurturing and caretaking that is making our young people the emphasis is in the wrong place. So we want them to be interdependent, to be able to be independent when no one's around. But if someone's around, or if they need help, that they can reach out, or they can say, I need therapy, or I want to go talk to my friend, or I'm going to go talk to my mom and dad, or, but it's this idea that they feel they have to be. It's shameful in our culture to need anyone or to be dependent. So I think that's an interesting concept of what is strength? What is emotional strength and mental health? Margaret Mahler, a very famous psychoanalyst, said that strength is built from being able to emotionally refuel whenever you need to with the relationships that are securing and mooring for you. And so that might be your mother, that might be your father, that might be your friends, that might be your therapist. But strength comes from emotionally refueling.
Wow, that is very powerful. And, as you're talking about the interdependency, It reminds me of that article that you wrote in the Wall Street Journal about Simone Biles and how she had to take a step back mentally during those last Olympics. Yet her team, they rallied around her. But at the same time, we were putting some really negative stuff out there on social media. How can we do better?
So interesting is if you looked at social media, I mean, that's why I wrote that piece. If you looked at social media during that time, people were just horrible and saying, you know, she knew what she was getting herself into. I mean, I don't even want to repeat it because they were awful comments. But what I can say is it is part of our culture, really, to be not compassionate. We are not a compassionate culture. I mean, we're becoming a more compassionate culture. I think, you know, there are movements to become a more compassionate culture, but we have trouble being compassionate. It's a very harsh culture. I guess you could say our culture has a lot of good things to it. It has, you know, we were based on, I mean, you know, where freedom and independence and all that comes from in our culture. But we were also a very puritanical culture. It was based on puritanical, very rigid values. So I think we have to evolve as a culture. So we are more sensitive, empathic, embrace and value caretaking and nurturing again. We've really lost our way. And I think because we've lost our way as a modern culture, our children, we always say in my field that children are the barometers of how a family is doing. I will say children in our society are a barometer of how society is doing. And society is not doing okay because our children are not doing okay. If our children are not doing okay, society is not doing okay. Yeah. And, you know, a lot of people don't like the things I say because they're harsh truths, as my rabbi says, keep speaking the truth, even if it's painful to people. And even if, you know, you get lashback from it, but a lot of people don't like to hear the painful truth that, you know, we have to value nurturing and caretaking over everything again. Otherwise, our children are lost. I talk about policy recommendations, particularly with adolescents. Some of them have to do with, and I would say the easiest advocacy for most parents is go to your school, start with your school. And meaning whatever school your kids go to, advocate for things like more mental health workers in the school. Even if you have to do fundraisers in your community, raise the money for another social worker. So kids can have one-on-one sessions with someone in school where they don't have to pay for it. Parents don't have to pay for it directly because a lot of parents can't afford it directly. And there aren't enough mental health services outside of schools, but more mental health services in schools that catch things early, that are preventative, that are not just what we call medically oriented or symptom oriented. So if you wait for children to show signs of difficulty, you kind of miss the boat. And there are signs that are preventative signs that they show very early. Even if you see a child is struggling socially, that might be one of the first signs. Or a child is missing too much school because they're sick, because they're developing a school phobia. Mm-hmm. Or if a child is, the grades have dropped from A- and B+ to C's and D's, or if a child seems to be more aggressive, and aggression is a sign of stress. It's part of the fight or flight part of our HPA axis. So meaning it's part of how we in an evolutionary way respond to stress is to become aggressive, right? If we see a predator, we fight, and then, or if a child becomes distractible, all these kids are being diagnosed with ADHD. I think it's like a quarter of American kids are diagnosed with ADHD. I'm like, it's not a condition. It is a symptom of anxiety and what we call a hypervigilance of the right part of the brain, the limbic system. The threat sensing part of the brain is on high alert. No one is asking, why are these kids on high alert? What is the stress? What are the psychosocial stressors for that particular child? Is it that their family has marital conflict? Is it that there's alcoholism in the family? Is it that their mother is depressed or distracted or absent, or their father is abusive, or I could go on and on. Is it even that they've moved house and no one took into consideration that the transitions are hard for kids? So there's all kinds of psychosocial stressors that create stress for children, both external ones and internal ones. And we're not asking those questions. We're just slapping diagnoses and medicating kids because we just want to silence their pain and move on. So that is another thing schools can look for, is not just say your kid has ADHD, but to say your child is showing signs of being distracted. Is there something going on at home that might be causing the stress that would make them be more distracted? Instead, they say your child has ADHD. So we want to slap labels on things, but we don't want to actually understand what they mean, right? And we want to just get rid of the symptom. That's part of our culture too. Right, schools can be more vigilant about referring children for psychotherapy, talk psychotherapy, feelings-based talk psychotherapy, not just CBT therapy, which just gets rid of symptoms, but really gets to the root of what's causing the symptoms. Also, schools can start later because adolescents have something called sleep-wake phase delay, which is that they produce melatonin later in the evening, at least 2 hours after an adult. They feel sleep pressure 2 hours later than you do. And when you force them to go to sleep too early, they get something called sleep anxiety, which is then they get anxious that they can't fall asleep. And so parents think it's a discipline issue that kids don't go to sleep early when they're adolescents, but they actually don't feel sleep pressure till at least midnight or 1 in the morning. And so schools need to start later because a child who's not well rested is more susceptible to depression and anxiety. I mean, I have so many recommendations for schools, but those are just a couple of them.
Those are great recommendations. And I really hadn't thought about it, how I could participate being a part of the PTA in the school and how to utilize some of those tools.
I mean, the other thing is that, more trained teachers can do the training too. Teachers can train in mindfulness training, and they can be facilitators, even if they're not mental health workers. They can facilitate expression, social emotional groups in the morning, meaning when you come to school, there are some schools in New York who are doing processing of emotions before the day begins. So they go around in a circle in homeroom and they have everybody say how they feel that day. And is something going on that's making them feel rotten, or are they happy, or are they sad? Or so they can really discuss what's going on inside and outside of their lives. And also mindfulness training, meaning teaching them to do even 10-minute meditations before school starts, and visualization and breathing exercises and ways to regulate their emotions. But the most important thing is to give them adults that they can turn to who really care and want to understand and want to listen. Because a lot of the kids that are going into the school system come from homes where their parents are not that emotionally intelligent. That's the truth. And so a lot of emotional repression, a lot of situations where for one reason or another, they don't feel comfortable. There's not an open enough experience of communication. So they have to have adults that they can turn to process their emotions and their feelings. I try to get parents to be that, but teachers can also be that.
One section that really stood out for me in your book was the section where you were asking us as parents to look into a mirror and how we need to be truthful with our feelings. I know a lot of times I will say to someone who's asking me, how am I doing? I'm fine. And if I can't be truthful with my own feelings, how am I supposed to teach that to my kids?
One thing is, maybe don't ask the question, how are you doing? Ask the question, how are you feeling today? Because how we're doing is different than how we're feeling. And so, I mean, that's the first thing, but I think adults have to model it. So I always think that when teachers are leading these groups in the morning, they have to start with themselves. Somebody has to open up. And it's a little bit of, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. It's that game, and so if the teacher says, and I'll start. So I'm feeling kind of anxious this morning because I had a hard time commuting, and there was a driver that got close to my car and it scared me, and I'm feeling a little shaken up this morning. And then you go around, and then the next kid says, and I'm feeling angry because my dad yelled at me this morning and I didn't deserve it. And and you go around the circle, and you'd be surprised, once you kind of crack the door open a little, kids want to express themselves. They do want to express themselves, and just have to, it's very little nudging to get them to open up. Sometimes with parents, if there's not a culture of openness in a family, parents, it takes time to create a culture of openness. But I encourage parents to try, to express their feelings first, so kids feel comfortable, expressing their own.
So, what I'm hearing is how important it is to really be able to express your feelings. You want to be able to see that true self. What kind of culture are we creating if we're not able to get to that? You have the CDC in 2019 saying that the second leading cause of death in Blacks ages 15 to 24 is suicide. And you have a strong Black woman, Miss USA, Chelsea Chris, being a prime example of that.
Yeah, again, it gets back to what kind of culture are we creating for our children when we don't model for them kind of vulnerability. That vulnerability is strength. Vulnerability is the willow in the storm. And so we're strong only if we're comfortable with our vulnerability, and we trust people enough to be interdependent. That creates strength. But we are not strong if we stand alone. We're never strong if we stand alone. I mean, teasing and bullying is a major problem in schools today. It was in my day, because, as I said, I was teased and bullied by this group of girls. But in my day, there wasn't social media, there wasn't technology, and so it remained contained in a way. It was not that it was good, but it remained contained. And today, it's really it's terrible, because it doesn't remain contained. It can actually become a very, very big and traumatic issue. But the idea is that we have we have to think about, what do we teach our kids when they are teased and bullied? Do we teach them to stand alone? Do we teach them to stand together with their peers? The answer is, and the best answer is, when parents have a child who's being teased and bullied, it's helping to reinforce that child's own community. Because when children stand alone, when they, in the face of others' aggression, they are more vulnerable. That it's better if they have groups. It's better even if that group is 2 other kids who are nerdy like you are, or whatever. We are more strong when we stand together with other people than when we stand alone. And when you ask someone, how are they doing, and they don't feel comfortable telling you, that person believes that they are stronger if they stand alone.
And we're teaching generation after generation how important it is to stand alone. And then with you tying in how social media is factoring in with the standing alone, individuals are just posting what's picture perfect and not really displaying the whole truth. How do we as a society be able to show our children that it's okay to not just be that picture perfect smile that they see on social media?
Well, I think social media does promote idealization. So one of the tasks of adolescents is to, the biggest task is to find your place in the adult world. But one of the other big tasks, I think, is, when we're talking about idealizing and de-idealizing, is to de-idealize your parents, to not see them as perfect, and to let go of perfection in yourself. So when you're in middle adolescence, which is, about 14 to 18, when you're in middle adolescence, you're very self-conscious. There's a lot of self-consciousness. The pimple on your nose, you think everybody just sees that pimple on your nose, and you are a big pimple. That's all you are. And there's a lot of, and it has to do with brain development. The amygdala is the threat sensing part of the brain is very active, and the PFC, or the emotional regulation part of the brain, lags behind in development. So there's a lot of hypercriticism, self-criticism, self-consciousness, sensitivity to others' criticism. So it's like the worst time for social media, because social media, it presents images that aren't even real. We know now that they are manipulated, like photos can be manipulated to look better than they are. And so, the idea that adolescents who struggle with their bodies and their skin and their hair, and they're sort of, I would say, they're not fully formed adolescents. And I know I went through a terrible period of, just feeling awkward with my looks and my teeth and my nose and my hair. Everybody, has that period. And to then see these images of these perfect model looking, in our day, in my day, it was the fashion magazines that made you feel that way. But the difference is, you had to go out of your way to pick up a fashion magazine, and then you could put it down and walk away. The problem is your phone is always with you. And so that means it's like having an open fashion magazine all the time, with skinny, perfect this. And first of all, it's not real. So first you have to teach your kids that those are not real images. Those are touched up images, meant to manipulate you and buy things and, join things. But so that's the first thing. But also for you to not need to be perfect. Is as women, if we, don't wear our makeup every day, if we kind of dress sloppy sometimes, if we don't always, if we have a pimple and we just go, oh, well, I have a pimple. Oh, well, I'm having a bad hair day, but that's okay. Everybody has. It's how we treat our own imperfections that helps our children to know that they can have imperfections and it's okay. Yeah, that's it. It's really modeling.
Thank you for saying that. I think it's very important that us as parents be able to understand that it's okay to make mistakes, and that what we're modeling isn't perfection. And another part that I want to touch bases on is what we were discussing as far as bullying is concerned. How do we deal with that in social media, especially in a time where the new term of cancel culture has such negative connotation to it? How do we teach our teens that it's not about canceling them, but being held accountable?
Well, again, I take a lot from my faith, and we talk a lot in Judaism about the idea that we're not meant to be punitive. We are meant to be forgiving. And I think in Christianity that's talked about too, the idea of forgiveness. And we as a culture have gotten so far away from forgiveness. I don't know if you heard about this whole Whoopi Goldberg thing that's going on. And it's interesting because as a Jew, I would say, Whoopi Goldberg has been kind of barbecued publicly when she should have actually been a partner in this idea. I don't know if you know this, what's happening with her, but it's just an example of how she was suspended because she made some anti-Semitic, quote unquote, anti-Semitic comment. And I think that it's really important that we allow people, as long as they aren't heinous things, that we allow people to make mistakes, and that we partner with them, that we allow people to make mistakes and take responsibility and move on from them, that we don't say one strike you're out, because what that does is it creates that perfectionistic example for our children, that if you make a mistake, you could be canceled. You could, if you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, you could be totally thrown out socially. That's a terrifying idea. that you can't stumble, that you can't fall, that you can't learn from your mistakes is a terrifying idea that is actually contributing to a lot of their anxiety. And it's real, unfortunately, because the culture has become so intensely hypervigilant that, yeah, it's a scary culture.
You were talking about your faith, and I know for me, one of the key things that I try and teach my kids is that out of all things, God is love. And I did notice that there was a little section in your book in which you leaned on your faith. And I remember seeing a phrase that really stuck to me that said, if you don't believe in God, it's okay. Lie to your kids about that. Why is that important?
Well, faith, there's a Harvard study that came out that says that belief in some religion, it doesn't matter which religion, some faith-based raising of children creates more resilience to stress in those children. So I think there were 1,000 families that were part of the study. I think it's 1,000 or more. And of those 1,000 families, the children who came out the most resilient are the ones who were attending at least one service a week, or at least were given some sense of faith and being raised in a faith-based environment. The reason for that being that faith is obviously about, the idea of some guiding, supportive figure in your life other than your parents, but it's more than that. It's community. And community is a big part of it. It's community service, because most faiths have some idea of giving to others, sort of communal support. And so there's a lot more to faith than just, empathy and compassion. And those are all principles of most religions. And so, yeah, there's a lot of advantages that are not just believing in God. A lot of it has to do with community. And so, those kids do better than the kids who are told that when you die, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and you're nothing. And nihilism, I say in an article I wrote for the Wall Street Journal, nihilism is fertilizer for anxiety and depression.
Yeah. Wow, Erica, you've really dropped some great gems on us today. I know one of the things that you talked about was that a chapter that you would have put in your book would have been about COVID. So can you tell me some of the tools that you would suggest to us parents post-COVID to give to our adolescents?
Well, again, I'm not sure that COVID is all bad. In some ways, it has been devastating to our youth. And in some ways, it's been perspective giving. In terms of, people spending more time with their families, spending more time working from home, not dropping their kids off in institutional daycare, for 12 hours a day like they used to, really kind of reflecting on relationships being the most important thing. A lot of people quit their jobs. And so I think there might be actually a positive that comes out of COVID. And that's the optimist in me. I don't think it's all negative. I think that there's going to be a lot of changes in society and in family structures because of COVID. So, so that will be an interesting kind of chapter, as you say. What happens a decade after COVID? I mean, obviously, there's going to be some negative, it's left a lot of kids in a fearful state, and we're going to have to deal with that for many years. But there's also been a lot of good that's come out of it too.
Yeah, I feel the effects on my life as well. Out of the negatives, I recognize the very real positive aspect that my husband gets from being able to work from home and pick up our son every day from school, from kindergarten.
I think children are very sensitive to not being the center of their parents' universe. I think what's happened in the past 50 years is that again, a lot of good has come out of the women's movement, and it's a lot of good when I'm a benefactor of a lot of that good. But I think a lot of what's happened is that children used to be the center of parents' universe. And I think careers now and other personal endeavors have become the center of our universe as adults. And I think we can try to lie to ourselves and say that our children are still the center of our universe. But I think how we base what is the center of our universe is how much time we spend on that endeavor or with that relationship. And I think children are very sensitive to the discrepancy between what parents say and what they actually do. So, if a parent says, I love you more than anything, but I only spend 90 minutes a day with you, but I love you. Children are very sensitive to they know when they're not the center of their parents' universe, and they need to be. I mean, children need to be the center of their parents' universe. It doesn't mean we all have to work and we have to make money. And I get it. My husband and I both have to work and make money. And I have always been, quote unquote, a working mom. But in the early years when my kids were little, we sacrificed a lot financially. To allow me to be able to be there as much as possible. And so nothing's perfect. No one's perfect. But I think the idea is children are very sensitive to when their parents are distracted. And I'll just give you one more example. I sing. And when my kids were little, I sing in temple now. When I was younger, I used to sing like amateur. I was an amateur opera singer, whatever. But whenever I would sing to my kids, they would like it for a minute. And then they would say, stop it, mommy, stop it. Because they don't want your narcissism, which is expressed through singing, anything that expresses your own narcissism, they're very sensitive to. They want the attention back on them. And so, right, that is, I would say that's a real key to health with children, is that they are the center of your interest and the center of your universe. And a lot of that has to be met with the amount of time that we spend with them and how much attention we give them, and whether we turn off our devices and whether we're really interested in them. Because you can't fake interest. That's the problem. You can't fake it.
Yeah. So I understand what you're saying about children really being intuitive and really wanting you to be that center of attention around their world. But jumping to my profession, for example, what happens when you have a family who's in the neonatal intensive care unit? They could be there for days, weeks, or months. And maybe that child at home just isn't really understanding what's going on. How do we as healthcare providers give these families the tools to help navigate and help that child at home who no longer is that center of the world?
So again, loss is something that happens. Adversity is something that happens. It is an adversity to have a child who's in a neonatal unit, and it's an adversity to the child you already have, right? So the child who's at home, who has now lost time with you, and that you've disappeared and are spending days and hours at the hospital. It's a tremendous loss for that child. So again, children are not born resilient. They're born vulnerable. And so that means that they rely on you to help them to process the loss and their emotions. So life isn't perfect. And sometimes, we're dealt cards, and our kids are dealt cards that are not fair. Mm-hmm. But it's addressing the unfairness with your child. It's letting them express their sadness. It's encouraging them to express their anger. That this baby has come into the world, and can't the baby go back, mommy? I don't want that baby. I hate that baby. I wish that baby would die. I wish you'd come home again. And not to say to your child, don't say that. Oh, no, we don't want to say. Don't stop your child from expressing emotion, because they just introvert that emotion and they'll become depressed. Because when we invert our anger and our sadness, that leads to depression. So we want to encourage our children to express how they feel, whatever it is, rage, sadness, and help them to process it and say, that's natural that you feel that way. And anytime you feel that way, come to mommy, and, and we'll check in every day and talk about how we're feeling. And so it's processing. So think of yourself as a parent, as, and I guess as a neonatal nurse, it's teaching parents that it's okay that the children that they have are angry and sad, and that they have to give them opportunities to express even what is in the parent's mind, the worst possible thing, which is that that older child or the toddler wishes that baby would die. And that if they say that, it's not the end of the world, that they've got to get it out, and they've got to hear compassion from you. I understand it's hard. It's such a hard thing that that this beautiful baby that is your sibling is not able to come home and play, and that mommy needs to be, you need to be able to process how hard it is. So that's how you help children with adversity. You don't make it go away, because you can't. You can't always be in two places at once, but you have to process their feelings.
Thank you so much, Erica, for your time today. I really enjoyed this conversation that we've had, and I think that your book is extremely important, and I think that it will give parents the tools that they need to help their adolescents as they navigate through this complex world that we're living in now. I'm going to reread your book and tell everyone to read it as well. And so I want to once again thank you again for joining us on Neonatology Today media platform, and we appreciate it.